Welcome to the Ignited Recovery Podcast, a new way forward for anyone looking for answers but feeling left out. If you've been searching for empowerment, triumph, and purpose, you've found them right here. You won't hear the same solutions, and you're not going to have any excuses to fall back on, because Ignited Recovery allows heroes to rise and become their best selves. I'm Dr. Adi Jaffe, and I can't wait to be your guide on this journey. Are you ready to become an ignited hero? Hey everybody, I'm so excited to share with you this episode where Sophie and I do a live Q&A from our participants and our listeners, you guys. This episode answers so many questions that we commonly get from our community, so we really wanted to bring it back around for you to see if you identify or if you identify this with anybody else in your life, because, that happens too. Regardless, I just want you to know we love hearing your questions and we love serving our community. That's always been our intention behind Ignited from the get-go. Our goal is to help as many people as possible. So we're going to start sharing more Q&As from the community on the podcast. And if you have questions, a question, multiple questions, a whole episode's worth of questions, please feel free to ask us anything. Just head over to ignited.com/questions, and we really, really look forward to connecting with you. I'm Adi Jaffe, coming to you today from Yoga Glo, from the headquarters deep in Santa Monica. I wanted to do an episode here that where maybe we can talk openly with some of our friends about maybe what you guys see, because I know what I've seen through my own experience, and I've shared about this before, right? My drug addiction issues and some of the stuff that Sophie and I have gone through. And I know some of the people sitting here right now who I've either worked with before or work with now, and their stories. But I feel like we're still in a place in the US especially where addiction is one of those things that you talk about if you have to. And by that, I mean, if you're struggling so badly that you need help right now, immediately. And if it's not that bad, you hide. You hide it from other people close to you. And if people in your family know, then they hide it from everybody around because they don't want the family name to be tainted. And that still exists for things like alcohol addiction or, alcoholism, as a lot of people might still call it, which is not that new. It's been around for a while. But when I get asked about this, and I want to see how people here feel about this. When I hear about addiction in the media, primarily, it's because somebody screwed up. It's because somebody got a DUI, somebody got arrested, somebody fell flat on their face, somebody embarrassed themselves or embarrassed people close to them. That's when I tend to hear about it. And in my opinion, that still ends up creating this version of what addiction is or what addicts are, which is they are helpless people who always screw up, never do well, fail repeatedly, and are in some way hopeless. And then am I right that once that happened, there's one of two options. Either they got over it and then you never hear about it again, or they kept falling down, and then what you hear about is the fact that they keep falling down.
Right.
Yeah, right. That's the reason I wrote this book. The reason I tell my story over and over and over, even though I'm honestly pretty bored of it after 15 years, to be perfectly honest with everybody, is because you never hear the other stories. You never hear the stories of the people who got their act together. Those people never come back and say, oh, FYI, I used to struggle with drugs and alcohol, totally good now, just so you all know. Nobody tells that story, and I think it's part of what helps perpetuate this version of addiction. I'm just going to ask you guys questions straight out because I don't feel like you're going to walk up to it otherwise. Is there anybody in the room right now who has seen someone else in life struggle with alcohol, drugs, any sort of addiction or compulsion? Okay. 90% of the room is raising their hand. Is there anybody who's willing to talk about what that looked like? You don't even have to give your name. So it's only the people in this room right now who will know that you said something.
So my experience with addiction has been since I was very young. So my mother has struggled with alcohol and drug addiction since I was an infant. And that was very formative in my childhood. So that's been, I would say, arguably probably one of the most, that experience has, in retrospect, influenced a lot of my life and the way I've shaped my life today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you were living with her the whole time?
No.
Oh,
so that's part of this. My story is that really came to a head initially when she left my father and me and my sister when I was about 10 months old.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so what, if you don't mind, I mean, especially after an experience like that at 10 months and then the stories, right? So you would hear stories and you would ask questions. And what was your concept of what an alcoholic or a drug addict is like?
So what's really interesting about this, and I look at my girlfriend because we had a very intense weekend visit with my mother, probably, was it 2 weeks ago? She was down here. There was a whole story that I had been told and then expanded in my mind of what reality was through my childhood, because I have no memory, whether some of that was just before I was able to retain that or some of that was because I had sort of decided to block it out. But it was probably the most therapeutic experience that I've had in building that relationship with my mother, because, and my mom likes to talk a lot in general, but she just sat there and just gave us the business for hours and shared her story and what she was struggling with. And the general theme and the arc of the story that I knew from what I was told from other family members was, I'd say, fairly accurate.
Yeah.
But the underlying details behind that and the pain and the struggle and the battle that she was fighting to try to come back. And I mean, I always loved my mother, but it completely shifted my perspective of who she was as a person, from sort of this source of pain and frustration and somebody that had brought challenges to now I'm like, she is the most inspirational person I've ever come in contact with. Like how much life experience she has and all those things.
Yeah.
So
I was going to ask that. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I was going to ask if that shifted, obviously it shifted your sense of who your mom is.
Mm-hmm.
What did it do to your concept of, what was your concept beforehand of people who struggle with this sort of stuff? And what is it now that you've had that conversation with your mom?
Yeah, I feel fairly fortunate in the sense that I think I've seen a lot of positive stories through addiction. I have two good friends, as you've met one of them, that I actually work with who have taken a little bit more of a traditional route, but both have been sober for what I would think most people would consider a fairly extensive period of time.
Yeah.
I don't know if I've thought of it definitively of how I view addiction. But I definitely know that it changed how I view the role that addiction played in my mother's life.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's interesting about this, and a question I was going to ask you. Yeah. So I bought a bunch of copies of the book because I have a lot of people in my world who have had challenges with addiction. And for most of them, right, the route has been the 12-step program, right? The traditional approach. Now, it took my mom 6 times, and now she's been sober for almost 5 years.
That's awesome.
So this is the longest period she's ever been sober. But my question is, like, how do I open the conversation when my perspective is like, it's working, but I'm not super sure it's going to continue to work, right? That traditional method. And it's almost fear. Like I'm afraid to say, hey, check this out. This is a different approach, because for all of these people that I'm thinking of, there's 4 people in particular, they're in a place right now where it's good, but from an objective perspective, and maybe this is wrong for me to be even looking at it this way, but I see this level of fragility and like, don't rock the boat, like just leave them alone.
Yeah. So first of all, I love the part of really being able to shift how you see your mom's story. And I don't know how many people have had that experience where just seeing one person whose experience and life story runs counter to however you perceive anything can completely alter your view of an entire set of people. It's part of what I hope will end up happening for us in terms of the political conversation in this country at some point, because we end up demonizing whole groups. And then you had such a personal experience with somebody that obviously is supposed to be such a source of support and love for you on an ongoing basis, and that got broken. But you got to circle back around and really understand as an adult, understand her point of view and her journey, and it shifted something for you where all of a sudden you got to have that love again.
30 years later.
Yeah. I mean, you know what I always say, man? I mean, obviously better late than never, but it also would have been a completely different relationship if it would have started back then, because your mom hadn't been through the journey to be able to come back and have that conversation she just had with you. And that's, to me, part of the book is about respecting people's journey, whatever it might look like. It doesn't need to look like mine. Like, and to answer your question, my recovery story was actually pretty traditional until I decided to make it different. But I was sober for 3 years when I decided to take my first drink. Boris knows the person that I was with, the girlfriend at the time that I had a sip of champagne from, sitting by the beach in Hermosa. But it was a decision. I waited 6 months and talked to a lot of people. And
you did the 12-step.
I was in 12-step for 3 years beforehand.
Because it was court mandated, right?
It didn't start out court mandated. A lawyer essentially sent me to rehab saying, if you don't do this, you're going to go to prison for a really long time. And I went, cool, let's go to rehab. And that's the way a lot of people end up there. And I failed one rehab, and then through that experience realized I really got to get my stuff together, or man, I would swear more if my kids weren't here right now. I'm so glad they are to just keep me clean. But I would owe Leo $1 for every time, and I just don't have that kind of cash. But he's like, swear, Daddy, swear. just let loose. So I failed the second rehab. Is a story I tell a lot, where I had to own that up to my dad, and that was a shift for me and my dad, where I was honest with him when I quote unquote didn't have to be. Like, I had the lie ready in my mind. But the journey is unique for everybody. So my journey was 3 years of sobriety, followed by a very gradual reintroduction of alcohol, whatever it is, 13 years ago now. Is it 13? 13 years ago now. And I'm good. I'm fine, right? We've got alcoholic drinks here. I had one alcoholic and 2 non-alcoholic drinks. Pretty much nobody in my life at this point is scared that I'm going to go off the deep end later. That took years to develop. And the answer to the question is, I call this the abstinence myth, because for anybody not aware, you have to shock people into action today. I couldn't call this, everybody's path is different. People go like, cool, got it, So I called it the abstinence myth because I think there are myths related to abstinence, like for some of these friends you're talking about. In that situation, the myth is that the quitting is what will fix you. The quitting doesn't fix anything. The quitting fixes addiction pretty much in the same way that, taking Advil fixes a broken leg. It'll take away some of the pain because the consequences around you will resolve, but the underlying issue is still there. And if you don't fix that, you're going to be struggling really for a long time. And that fragility that you mentioned centers around the notion that, and I deal with this with clients all the time. Today is Tuesday, and we had our weekly chat, and one of the people on it was saying, I have addiction down. He's not afraid that he's going to go relapse anymore, but he feels so overwhelmed and so just wrought with anxiety that life is going to fall apart. And I said, this is great, because that's the stuff that had you addicted in the first place, and that's what you went to cover up. How do you deal with that? And my problem with traditional treatment primarily is that the language that gets used is so stigmatizing. And so sure, does anybody here know somebody who's been sober for like 20, 30 years? Yeah. People who've been sober for 20, 30 years are indoctrinated, right? Like, it is their religion. They are in. And so what they say to me is, I'm a proud addict. And I go, well, that's cool, but you're 30 years into this process. You're not my audience. You're good. And whatever you did that worked for you, keep it up. I'm talking to the 90% of people who aren't getting help. And to them, just the notion of being called an addict is blasphemous. They don't want that label to ever be applied to them. And what we keep doing to them is saying, well, you have to, otherwise you can't get help, right? And so to your friends, they've already walked past the step. They walked through the door. There's nothing that precludes somebody doing the work that's in here while being abstinent in a 12-step program. but the language will change. So, and I have some people on the course, on the Ignited Recovery course right now, are in AA or in SA, Sex Addicts Anonymous, or something like that. And what they find is that some of the language just really bothers them, like having character defects, for instance, is one of those things that I came a pretty clean slate. You know, we've got 3 kids now. Each one of my kids is different. They were born different. Leo and Kai are not the same human. There's nothing we could have done to make them the same. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's exactly the way it should be. The defects are things we learned along the ways. There's some ways that we messed up the way we approach the world. And some of that is biological, and we need to address it biologically. But a lot of it is psychological and environmental. And so those friends that you're talking about, the fragility gets addressed by fixing those issues. And the way I talk about it in the book, at least, is the only way to fix those issues is to be really honest about what they are, not in a judgmental sort of way, but to start saying, you know, I've been anxious my whole life. And not ignore it, not try to run away from it, not just go to another meeting, unless the meetings fix your anxiety. But if you're still anxious on a day-to-day basis, figure out what's bringing it up. And most of the time, not always, but most of the time, and I don't know if anybody in this room can relate to this, what I've found is it's feelings of inadequacy. You talked about your experience, feelings of rejection, really dysregulated attachment early on in life when family members just couldn't be there for you the way they needed to be. And so you learn to function because you just had to, right? If you live in a household where your parents scream at each other every day and throw stuff around and maybe one of them beats you a little bit when they feel like it, you're a kid, you're going to learn how to function. You're going to learn how to just make it through. And whatever you come up with, for somebody to call that a character defect 30 years later, because one of the ways you learn to deal is by drinking a bunch because walking in the house is scary, I don't understand how that fixes anything. So what I try to do is walk away from the stigma and the shame and just say to people, you're as good as you could be in this moment based on the experience you had. Now let's get better. And that's the idea.
Devin told me a little bit about the book, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but part of the idea is that if you get to the root of the problem, you fix the problem, there's reintroduction, right? Or there
can be reintroduction.
There can be. Yeah. So I guess my question for you, because I actually have a friend who was addicted to drugs and can drink alcohol now because there's no trigger. If he's around Coke or anything like that, that's when things can go dark.
Yeah.
So he can do it. He can have a couple drinks. It's totally fine. When you're working with people, or I guess when people are kind of suggesting the book to their friends, at what point does reintroduction make sense for someone where as a loved one, you're worried about them maybe dabbling a little bit could turn them down a different path? Yeah. How do you kind of navigate that with your clients? That's
such a great question. Somebody literally asked that exact same question on the chat today. He's been sober for 3 years, so a really similar story to mine. And the first question he asked on the chat today was, so once I do this, can I drink again? And I was like, well, I have a short answer to that question, and I have a much longer answer to that question. I said, yes, you can drink again when you don't want to ask me that question. Which people
You're not
hate.
counting down the days.
People hate that answer. But if you're just waiting for the moment to drink, something is making you wait for the moment to drink, and I got to fix that in you first. And that's much easier said than done. But look, like today when I had a drink, it was to hang out with people and have a drink. My social anxiety was resolved with you all here as I'm trying to read this book. And if you notice, I didn't look at a single one of you the whole time because that would be too anxiety provoking for me. And so I figured out how to navigate the world without that stuff. And I had to do that before I could reintroduce anything. But you asked a question about drugs versus alcohol, which is a really important question because it's not often, it's not that it's never happened, but it's not often that people come to me and say, hey, I'm snorting pills. When can I snort pills again? Most of what people want is to just be able to be normal. That's all people want, right? So I don't know about you guys. I don't go to these parties that much anymore. Guaranteed they exist because they existed when I was using and they still do. But I haven't been to a party where people like crush oxys and snort them on a table anymore. I used to go to them, but I used to go to parties where people smoke meth in the corner and all that kind of stuff. So what people want is not that, because that still looks dark and it still feels dirty. People want to be able to go out and hang out with their friends and have a glass of wine at dinner. That's a fantasy that people walk in with, right? what I tell people all the time is the only way that will work is if when you go back to it, you're not at all using that for coping. And I don't know how your friend who you just talked about uses alcohol. But what I hear happens is that part of it is still to fit in. Part of it is still to make himself a little bit more comfortable at these parties and a little bit more like that description I read about my first drinking event. That was monumental for me. I mean, reading it on a piece of paper does not do it justice, but like, I'm nervous around everybody. I don't know how to talk to them. Oh, I don't care what you guys think of me. It was huge for me. And it sounds like for your friend, there's still a little bit of that going on. And then what happens is the other stuff starts going around. There's some people in this room right now. I'm not even going to look at them right now because they know who I'm talking about. But when I went back and I was sober and I started drinking again, around midnight, people start going into bathrooms together. You know what I'm saying? It's like all of a sudden people are disappearing to the bathroom together. They're coming out. People are starting
Every
to fight
15
about
minutes.
yeah, but like
15 and a half minutes.
yeah, or like one person stays in the bathroom and like three people go to visit them. It becomes a very communal urinal experience, essentially, is what happens. And I use that as my cue to leave. But I'll tell you what, for years, I stayed away from meth. And I knew...
Now we just do it on Thursdays and Fridays.
No, we do zero meth ever. But after Sophie just talked about some stuff in the last podcast, I don't even want her to joke about things like this. But I stayed away from it because I was scared like your friend is. And it sounds like your friend might have actually sampled a few times while drinking, and then it turned into a nightmare for a lot of people around. I stayed away from my drug of choice for years for that reason. And what I realized was happening when Sophie and I started, we were dating when this happened, actually. So this must be, no, you had already moved in. I'd stayed away even from watching things about meth. So Breaking Bad had come out, and I wouldn't watch it. I started watching Breaking Bad after the show was off the air. It was on for like 9 or 10 years or something, right? I didn't touch it until it was done. But Sophie always wanted me to watch, we haven't told this story in a while, Sophie wanted me to watch 6 Feet Under.
Yeah. Classic.
Anybody
Watch
remember
it.
that show, 6 Feet Under? Is that Showtime?
HBO.
HBO. Sorry for all my... There's probably like Showtime and HBO people right now just yelling at me on the other side. Got it, HBO. So she wanted me to watch it. I'd never watched it. We put the first episode on. We're watching it together. We're laying in bed. The laptop's on our lap, and we're just like happy. And in the first 5 minutes, the father is driving the car. He reaches down to grab a joint, gets dropped by a bus and killed. My dad had died about 2 months earlier before watching this episode. And then the brother, one of the brothers, calls the sister to let her know that this happened, and she's with her meth dealer boyfriend smoking. And I just shut the laptop like, I can't watch this. Yeah, right. I wanted like season 47. Well, what happens at the end of all of this? But my heart was racing. I felt scared for the first time in a really, really long time. And we didn't open that thing back up for like 3 to 6 months or something.
We still haven't watched it.
No, we watched it. We watched some of it. But then it just got boring and we stopped watching it. But which is what happened with Breaking Bad 2 at the end of the story. So I know this is what ended up happening for me. And this is a realization I made that I started using with clients. And maybe this could help your friend. Forget the when, because it sounds like he's drinking. It's just sometimes it leads to bumps in the road, literally, by the way. Did not mean that pun when it came out. But what I learned was that in neuroscience, the only way to change the relationship between you and anything in the world is to activate it again. If you leave a memory intact the way that it's always been, it'll stay there for decades. And everybody here knows this from their past at some point. If you have does anybody have like an incredible birthday memory or like the first time you rode a bike or any one of those childhood memories, a place you used to go vacation with your family, any of those kinds of things? Anybody? Some people are shaking their head. If you close your eyes and you think about that place, you're almost transported to it. Why? Because you don't think about it often. And nothing is ever going to change it because you haven't gone back to that place in decades. And the way your brain remembers it is literally like reliving the original experience. That is your brain's version of memory. So what ends up happening to your friend a lot of times when they're a little inebriated and a little less in control of their behavior is the trigger comes up of somebody using. And their brain has a very automatic response of when I had some drinks and somebody comes in with blow, I know how the story goes. And there's an entire story written for it. And they just follow the script. That's all they're really doing is they're following their script. And what they have to start doing is writing a different script. The problem is you have to do it when you're normal and not inebriated first. And you got to do it actually like practice. And the way I do it with clients, for instance, this is a tip for anybody, but for your friend as well, is I have them literally close their eyes and describe what a night of drinking without that as an outcome would be. And then we describe what it would be like as a night without that added bonus. As an outcome would be, even if it showed up, like what if a friend comes to me and talks to me about it and has some, and they have to play it out in their brain. They have to tell you the story actively. And the first couple of times it feels really weird because their brain wants to tell the other story and they have to fight against it the whole time. But once they start being able to tell that story, they now have another narrative. They have a different version of what that story looks like. And it increases the probability that when they're confronted with that outcome again, when somebody brings it out again at a party, they now have told themselves and their brain has had to create a version of that occurrence that results in a completely different outcome. And it's kind of incredible how powerful our brains are. But I've done this with clients around drinking, around drug use, around inappropriate sexual behavior, around a lot of different stuff. They have to get over the shame of talking to you about it. It really helps a lot if they can practice it with somebody else, because otherwise they fudge it and they don't really tell the whole story. But I walk through with people and I have them tell me the story, and then I have them add details so that they can really get firm in it. And it's not like it's perfect, but what I've seen it do through repetition is it makes people's triggers weaker and weaker and makes them more and more able to confront them until one day, and this is the most beautiful thing that happens to a client, and I love it when it happens, they'll tell you that story of, oh yeah, I went to a party and somebody brought it out, or this thing happened and didn't even think about it. And it's the first moment in years that they feel like they've literally beat their addiction, and it's beautiful. Yeah. I don't even know how long we've been going for. Okay. Anybody else from the readings or anything else, any stuff that came up? You know, it's again, I just know that people that listen to the podcast really get more connected when it's somebody's personal story, and they've heard my story enough times. So, what stuck out to you from the reading? And why is Leo developing leg hair? What is happening to my kids? This is ridiculous. Stop growing already.
I mean, I think the book in general to me is just so refreshing. Like reading or not, like the whole thing is just refreshing. It's refreshing to just have another approach. And as we've talked about before, there's so many ways to heal. If you sprain your ankle, if you have depression, like there's all these other modalities, but with addiction, it's like we're just stuck in this one way, only way. And personally, that's just what's so inspiring to me, is just that there's another way, and it feels so much more welcoming and less culty. And, and if that other way works, like you said, great. But if it hasn't worked over and over again, and that's the only way, and you keep showing up to those rooms and you keep subscribing to all of that, and it doesn't feel like it's a good fit and it's healing you, I love that there's just another way.
Yeah. And by the way, I mean, this is not the only other way.
No.
There are other ways. I talk about some of them in the book, but there are other ways. I have zero monopoly over this thing. It's just that this is my way, and this is the way that worked for me. And what I find in some of the other ways that I still perturbs me a little bit, although I get, whatever works for you, is the finality of it all, right? I think that's what is really hard for people to deal with, is I have to do that and I have to do it forever. And it can never, if I turn away from this, like even the story you talked about, a slip up in that context, like when a night goes badly, based on the current story of addiction that we have, is a disaster. And so people play that's why I talk about this a lot in the book. People play out the disaster because that's the only way that they've seen it. I've heard this story from so many people who've had like a drink or, just had a drink. They had a really, really bad day and they had a drink. And then they say, F it. I already had a drink. Just going to finish off a 6-pack and maybe like a bottle. because tomorrow I'm going to have to go back and face everybody that I relapse. Might as well go all in. Well, if it's not an all or nothing kind of equation, you don't have to go all in. Just get a couple of beers, just relax and sleep it off, and you'll be fine.
So I have like my brother, like he drinks a lot.
Yeah.
And so how do you help a person see that this is addiction?
Great question.
You know, he drinks like this, you know, I'm just like drinking, it's Friday, or then Friday happens to be every other day of the week, and then it happens to be I'm driving with the kids in the car, and then, you know, it's just like, and then he stops, and then, you know, the pattern sort of, maybe something stresses him out, you know, and then it's, so how do you help a person like identify that this, you need help, and, you know, and then, and not have the help be, I'm going to slow down, because after a few weeks it's going to pick up again.
Totally. Great question. And I think it's a question that comes up for a lot of people. A lot of parents that talk to me ask this question. And I would actually, so I'll back it up a little bit and say that I don't need the people I work with to call it addiction. I would much rather work with them on why is it that they have to drink after work every day. And if I work on that well enough, they'll not need to drink after work every day. Does that make sense? So we fall into this trap a little bit where we believe that there's this invisible line somewhere, and it's like, here's all the normal drinkers, and they hang out here, and then you cross over some magical line, and here's all the alcoholic drinkers. But it's not true. There is no line. Nobody knows where that line is. Nobody understands where the line is. Some people can have 3 drinks or 4 drinks in a night and destroy their life. Like drive into a van that's parked, break up with their girlfriend where they don't mean to, like just not show up to work the next day and they had 4 drinks. Some people have 4 drinks 5 times a week and they're totally functional. The problem for drinking, let's say if we use that as an example, is around functioning. And so what I would ask first is, what's happening in their work life, what's happening in their personal life that makes them go to alcohol as the safety valve at the end of every day, at the end of every night, at the end of every week, whatever that is that happens, if that makes sense. I mean, I literally talk about an example like this in the book. I call her Terry in the book, but by the time she came to me, she was hiding vodka in her boots in her closet because she used to drink a bottle of wine at dinner, and then it became like a bottle and a half, and then her husband told her she can't drink as much. She tried to drink less, but she couldn't, so she would hide alcohol in the kitchen, and she would like go to serve everybody and have a couple of more swigs of wine in the kitchen. And then her husband noticed that she was drinking in the kitchen, so he said, now we can't drink at all, and he took all the alcohol away, which made him really mad, by the way, because he really liked to drink every night also, but he didn't see it as a problem. So now there's no alcohol in the house anymore. What was really happening is her relationship sucked. Her relationship was terrible. Her husband worked all the time. Like he traveled all the time. She never saw him. They now had 2 kids. She had to take care of the kids by herself. All the other mothers were starting to drink at lunch. This is like literally here in Orange County. All the other mothers started drinking at lunch because they were all bored as well. And so they had money. They had these beautiful kids. And they just drank all day because they had nothing else to do. And their relationship with their husbands were terrible. And by the time they came to me, she was the alcoholic who was drinking too much and needed to stop drinking. And he just looked at her like, she's sick. Somebody needs to help her. And after I worked with her for like 3 weeks, I go, what are we going to do about this relationship? Because I can fix your drinking, but you're going to go back to something because you can't live in that house the way things are going right now. You are going to need pills, or you're going to need something else to fix your life. Because if your life is broken, you're going to find, none of us can live in terrible conditions where we hate every day that we wake up to and just be okay, right? That's why alcoholism rates are rampant in countries where people have to be indoors for 8-9 months out of the year because they can't go outside because it's dark all year, right? That's why they all drink, is because they're miserable. And so they deal with it by just drinking. Why? Because drinking makes the time pass away. It makes you not really aware of your reality. So the question with your brother or anybody else who's dealing with this is a totally different conversation. It's to sit down and say, hey, what's going on? I notice you're really unhappy. What's happened? Can I help? Just forget the alcohol for a second, because the alcohol is their way of addressing the problems in their life. They just don't have another tool. And so if we can give them another tool, they'll start using one other tool. And then maybe they go, oh, well, that made things a little bit better. Maybe I can try one other thing, two other things, three other things. And then what I've noticed in people, now again, nothing works 100% of the time, so I'm not going to lie and say that this works 100% of the time. But if they're open to the idea of bringing other things into their life to make their life better, they start drinking less because they didn't really want to drink all the time. They just wanted to feel okay. They just wanted, Friday night was here, the week ended, they've hated life for 5 days, and they just wanted a break. Does that make sense? So I think we rely too much on who's an addict and who's not an addict. If you're suffering because you're drinking and you're struggling with alcohol, that's good enough for me. Call yourself whatever you want. But I think that would be a really interesting conversation to have. We've talked before about work expectations in your family and kind of what everybody's expected to do and get that job and make that money and, that kind of way of living. There are a lot of people in life that are miserable because they're living the life they're supposed to live. And there are people listening right now to the podcast going, yep, I pretty much hate my life. And they just deal with it. And we call Ignited because the whole idea is to tell people you don't have to do this to yourself anymore. There are ways to, even if your job sucks, and I'm not going to lie, not everybody is lucky enough to, I'll just call it out, to live in LA where the weather is this. We can somehow I don't even know how we afford the rent here. It's just absurd. Nobody works. Who's on the freeway at 11:45? How are people just always driving? Nobody works. It's weird. We afford some of the highest rents in the country and nobody works ever. And I get that not everybody can do this and go and have a podcast. Not everybody's programmed that way, and that's fine. But if you live a life that makes you miserable, you have to find other things to give you reward. You have to find other things that remind you why you can enjoy yourself and how to have fun and how to connect to other people and feel like you mean something and your life matters and people care about you. Because if you can't find those things, go ahead and drink because it's gonna suck. So the conversation I have with so many more people is, how do I make your life meaningful? That's where Ignited came from, is how do we ignite you? How do we get your passion back? How do we get you focused again on what matters? And then not all the problems, but a lot of the problems go away. Thank you for that, because that's something a lot of people struggle with. All right, we're going to end this part, and now we're just going to hang for the last little bit that we have here. Thank you all for tuning in from home. This was fun. Yeah, and if you have any comments on this, if there's anything that's been brought up for you because of the struggles you've had yourself or with family members, please talk to us. Please ask us questions. That's why we're doing this. Love you all. See you next week. Bye. Thank you for tuning in to the Ignited Heroes Recovery Podcast. I really hope you found the information here useful and that we'll see you back here next week. And look, I want to make sure that this podcast is the most useful it can be for you, so please let me know by emailing info@ignited.com if there are any specific topics or questions you'd like to have addressed. As usual, if you like this episode, I would love for you to leave us a 5-star review and rating. Thanks, and see you next week.